We've all heard of 1984, George Orwell's magnum opus. But it's worth reminding ourselves of the details, for what they can teach us about the totalitarian states of the 40s, and for the lessons we can still draw today. Those who lived in socialist states, and who managed to procure and subversively read a copy, were startled by Orwell's ability to describe not just the physical environment of their states, ones he had never visited, the universal smell of cabbage, the greyness of the dilapidated buildings, but also its mental and moral atmosphere. The vast stadiums where crowds gathered to sing the hymn to the wisdom and majesty of Big Brother are eerily similar to the festivals of Pyongyang. Orwell called it an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of consciousness by means of rhythmic noise. It inculcated a terrible conformity into the masses. The television in Ceausescu's Romania reported bountiful harvests, even as the population queued for their meagre ration of bread and a handful of potatoes, just as the telescreens in 1984's Oceania had done to a similarly deprived and shrunken population. Even to those that lived under them, who had known nothing else, their existence was a clear violation of human nature. And Orwell's genius was in capturing that so precisely, and communicating it with such liquid clarity. Oceania had its Stalinist 3-year plan, its cold water, grimy accommodation, gritty soap, sticky socks, and dilapidated services that were forever out of order. But Orwell has reached from the distant past to teach us much about the modern world too. And that insight was partially inspired by his experiences with the bureaucracy of the BBC, which has only grown more bloated, arrogant, disdainful and oppressive. In his 1984, adults are no longer the moral authority. They are fearful of a youth who have allied with the state to monitor their wrongthink. The concepts of newspeak and doublethink also perfectly encapsulate the woke mafia, which dominates the media, education, internet, and so much of public discourse, seeping into advertising, sport, literature, news, the corporate world, and every cultural avenue available. Orwell also presciently captured the crude rewriting of history, which underpins so much of our contemporary malaise, and which is pumped relentlessly into our youth. He wrote that, in the old days, before the glorious revolution, London was not the beautiful city that we know today. It was a dark, dirty, miserable place, where hardly anybody had enough to eat, and where hundreds and thousands of poor people had no boots on their feet, and not even a roof to sleep under. Children no older than you are had to work 12 hours a day for cruel masters who flogged them with whips if they worked too slowly, and fed them on nothing but stale breadcrumbs and water. But in among all this terrible poverty, there were just a few great big beautiful houses that were lived in by rich men who had as many as 30 servants to look after them. These rich men were called capitalists. They were fat, ugly men with wicked faces. They dressed in a long black coat that was called a frock coat, and a queer shiny hat shaped like a stovepipe, which was called a top hat. This was the uniform of the capitalists, and no one else was allowed to wear it. The capitalists owned everything in the world, and everyone else was their slave. They owned all the land, all the houses, all the factories, and all the money. If anyone disobeyed them, they could throw him into prison, or they could starve him to death. When any ordinary person spoke to a capitalist, he had to cringe and bow to him, and take off his cap, and address him as Sir. This is the worldview that saturated grievance studies That branch of academia immersed in theory and allergic to evidence. All the gender studies, queer studies, race studies, and what have you, that's now seeped into mainstream education, polluting it and poisoning the minds of a generation with twisted and unfounded resentment. A boiling rage that is tearing our societies apart and undoing the colossal achievements of our forefathers. It's a twisted, simplistic caricature of history. Because the reality is, it was capitalism that saved the masses from such appalling conditions. As Theodore Dalrymple writes, in this mindset, history is nothing but the backward projection of current grievances, real or imagined, used to justify and inflame resentment. Our current totalitarians aim to break us with the past and impose their own warped vision of utopia, just as Stalin, Mao and Pol Pot did before them. Their power is cultural and social rather than political. They cancel rather than kill people. But their power and their tyrannical intolerance are continuing to grow. Their dream is the same as Orwell's warning. The past has been abolished. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. If we are to take up the baton of Orwell, as we must, then we need to combat this plague with all our might. To win the battle of ideas that he laid out with such enduring and unforgettable prose and precision. Or else we'll betray our own past, as well as his sensational insight. If you'd like to support this channel, please like, subscribe, and think about picking up my books. They go into topics like this in much greater detail. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they're available on the links below. Please do feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.